Hey, what you're about to see is not the original edit of this video. The original edit was a lot prettier, but YouTube hates me and we can't have nice things. So for a lot of the B-roll footage, it's just gonna be footage of me playing Castle Crashers. I might put out like a Google Drive link of the original thing at some point. But yeah, no. You're getting a compromised version of this video because YouTube is awful, and they're terrible at recognizing what fair use is, even when it's disputed. Okay. This video will contain spoilers for the Nimona movie. Nimona is a 2023 Netflix 3D animated movie based on the webcomic by the same name, which was originally created by ND Stevenson, creator of She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, and one of the creators of Lumberjanes. It follows Ballister, a man on the run after an incident that leads him to becoming the most wanted man in his city, and his antics with the titular Nimona, a mysterious and fun-loving shapeshifter. There are a lot of things one can talk about with this film. In terms of representation, since that's what most of you probably know me for, we could talk about the queer relationship between Ballister and his lifelong friend Ambrosius. We could also talk about Ballister's disability and how that's represented in the film, though I think Oakworm already did a good job unpacking that. More broadly, we could talk about the undercurrent of classism in the film, or the way that the simultaneously medieval and futuristic setting reflects the deeper conflict in the film of old ideals versus more updated lines of thinking. All of these and more are things I would love to potentially talk about at some point, as this movie is a beautiful piece of art and deserves full and deep analysis, but for today's video, I will instead be talking about Nimona's storyline in this film, not the comic, and how it presents itself as an allegory for being transgender and the social context of that. Before I begin to actually unpack this, I would like to give a few disclaimers. Firstly, I would like to state just up front that Nimona herself is not canonically trans or non-binary or anything of the sort. While she does have lines like this,
"But I'm not a girl. I'm a shark."
I just think it'd be easier if you were a girl.
Easier to be a girl? You're hilarious.
And now you're a boy.
I am today.
she is canonically just a girl, and is referred to as such throughout the film, so that is how I'll refer to her in this video regardless of personal headcanon. Those lines, I'm pretty sure, are just a nod to the allegorical aspect of the plot. Typically, I would just refer to the character however they're cataloged in my mind, but since this video is specifically discussing her storyline as an allegory, I feel it is important to keep that distinction clear so there's not any confusion of allegory being the same thing as actual representation. With that said, it is also important to note that ND Stevenson, who wrote the original webcomic, has publicly transitioned in the recent years. At the time of writing the webcomic, he was not out, though he has gone on record saying that Nimona was at least partially him trying to work out those feelings through art.
I think that I always kind of felt like I don't know, I guess a disconnect from my body that like makes a little bit more sense now that I've, grown up and transitioned and I'm exploring my gender. But it was something that I just always felt like I was just something more than my body. And I still think that. I think everyone is. We're all so much more than the way we present ourselves to the world. And shapeshifters make that literal. Whatever she's feeling, she has the ability to make it real. And so I think that that was really what my inspiration was for her, just because like I always found those ideas so exciting and I wanted to see more of that. Like I wanted more shapeshifter stories that got into that.
He was not a writer on the film, but this is important context that should be kept in mind when discussing this topic. Whether or not you understand or agree with my points in this video, it is important to note both that this allegory was almost definitely intended by the writers, and ultimately Art is subjective. I am trans myself, which definitely inclines me towards this reading of the film, but allegories aren't meant to be one-to-one, so if you got something else out of this film, that's completely valid. I just ask that you be respectful about it. And as a final disclaimer, this video will discuss gender dysphoria, systematic transphobia, suicidal ideation, and a suicide attempt. If any of that is triggering or bothersome, maybe skip this one, or at least proceed with caution. With all that said, let's jump in. In case this wasn't already clear, the allegory itself is Nimona being a shapeshifter. The idea here is that you could go through the same story, but swap out her being a shapeshifter for her being trans, and things wouldn't change all that much, which is what makes it allegorical. There are many ways in which this is made clear throughout the film, but the first I want to talk about is the most internal. At one point, Ballister asks Nimona what it feels like to shapeshift, and this is what she has to say.
I feel worse when I don't do it. Like my insides are itchy. You know, like that second right before you sneeze? That's close to it. Then I shapeshift, and I'm free.
What if you held it in? If you didn't shapeshift?
I'd die.
Good Lord, that's horrible.
Don't be so gullible. I wouldn't die. I just sure wouldn't be living.
I am not the first to point out that this is a very accurate description of what gender dysphoria generally feels like, and shape-shifting in this instance could easily translate to medical transition or even just wearing clothes one feels more comfortable in. She feels more comfortable in these other forms even if they aren't as socially acceptable, and that's what really is the heart of the matter. If she wasn't uncomfortable just in her human form, then there wouldn't be any conflict in the film because she'd presumably just remain in her human form to avoid trouble, but the only way she can feel free is if she shapeshifts. This is the same reason why so many trans people will present how they feel even if their community is especially transphobic.
I didn't get kicked out because my parents didn't accept me for being gay. They didn't accept that their daughter was actually their son.
Obviously, this isn't always the case, and it is perfectly valid for somebody to choose safety or security over that feeling of freedom, but if dysphoria wasn't so uncomfortable, you just wouldn't have people transitioning for the most part, since there's so many downsides to it socially. That brings us to the other part of the allegory, and the part that takes up much more of the film. Social pushback. This internal feeling really only explicitly comes up in that one scene, but the central conflict of the film is external. So, the society that Nimona and Ballister live in has built its government and military around the idea that there is a monster beyond their walls that they need to protect themselves from. The story goes that many years ago, a woman named Glorich fought this monster, and now this city has structured itself around paranoia of this monster returning. A little bit before the climax of the film, we learn the truth. This quote-unquote monster was Nimona. She had been friends with Glorich when she was younger, and all was fine and dandy until Glorich's town saw her shapeshift. They immediately labeled her as a monster, and because these sorts of things are learned behaviors, and Glorich was a literal child, Glorich's view of her friend gets colored by these words, and she turns on Nimona, who flees from the scene. No one else knew that story apart from Nimona and Glorich, who is A, very dead, and B, likely had an altered view of events because of the biases planted in her head. So this whole city is shitting themselves in fear over essentially the unknown. None of these people have actually seen the monster, at least not knowingly, but they are horrified at the thought that somehow, someway it will show up, which is why they've put so much in place systematically to protect from it.
The second we let our guard down, something terrible comes over that wall.
Have you ever even been outside the wall?
Yeah, because I have a death wish. No, no one has.
So maybe there's nothing there?
Translating this through the allegory, we see a society afraid of this demonized idea of trans people, setting policies in place to protect from it, but really, most of these people have never knowingly met a trans person in their lives, and the laws aren't protecting anyone. In fact, they're just harming the citizens, both trans and otherwise. That's another thing. These anti-trans laws and the protections in this film don't only harm trans people and Nimona. The movie follows an average human guy who quite literally has been oppressed by the system since he was a child, despite his love for his city and his drive to feed into the protections that everyone's been brainwashed into praising.
Hey, everybody! Ballister thought I was gonna apologize for treating him like the trash that he is.
A lot of the anti-trans laws and policies we see are harmful to plenty of cis people as well, especially cis women, since most of these laws target trans women more than trans men. Just looking at America, as that's where I live, there are some states where any given person, typically a woman, can be accused of being trans and then be subject to very invasive and potentially traumatizing treatment or ostracization for that, even if she's not even trans. Transphobic beliefs can very quickly translate to being cruel to anybody who doesn't fit your idea of gender, especially since, despite what some people seem to think, you can't always tell if someone is trans.
Can you tell which of these people are transgender? Pretty hard, wasn't it? Or maybe you could pick out a few. Well, what if I told you that all those people that I just show you are people with transgender history?
That's almost always just guesswork, and when you're doing guesswork for something like that, there is a high chance that you will get it wrong sometimes, and that makes anti-trans policies and rhetoric dangerous and unfair for everybody. Also, trans people aren't actually a threat, so it's pointless anyways. This idea is most clearly illustrated in the climax of the film. Nimona has become what may just be her true form, but either way, she's this giant thing, and she's causing more harm to herself than anybody else, but the antagonist of the film is so scared of the idea of her that she literally turns a giant cannon on the city, knowing full well she'd be at risk of killing and injuring countless civilians just to target this one person.
Firing them will take out half the city. Innocent people will die.
And so will the monster.
Allegories tend to be hyperbolic, especially with children's media, to make the point clear, but I think it's a very effective way to communicate this idea. Beyond just the immediate harm presented as well, everyone in the city is constantly wary throughout the film of the thought that a monster could attack at any moment, and the military serves largely as just a way to comfort the citizens.
We are taking every precaution to keep you safe. Go about your normal lives, and rest assured that the Institute has this situation well in hand.
This isn't good for anyone, even the antagonist, who shows very clear signs of genuine fear, which is the emotion that drives her final decision.
It's happening. Sound the alarm! Sound the alarm!
We've talked about how this systematic oppression affects the society as a whole, but how does it affect Nimona? Well, she tries to kill herself. Shortly before she turns into a kaiju, Ballister shows that he's ultimately still afraid of her, even after all the time they've spent together.
Come on, say it! Say it! Say it, Emma!
She runs away, and this is when we learn about what happened with Chloric as well. She's hurt, she's traumatized, she's starting to believe what people say about her, and this is just too much. So she quite literally attempts to kill herself in front of the entire city.
I don't know what's scarier. The fact that everyone in this kingdom wants to run a sword through my heart. Or that sometimes I just want to let them.
Again, hyperbole, but there is a reason that there's such a high suicide rate among trans people. Despite what certain types of people might try to tell you, this isn't because trans people are broken or inherently unhappy. Most of the time, these feelings come either from the pain of dysphoria that they aren't able to treat because it's not safe to, or because the transphobia itself is so bad. Bullying from peers, abuse from loved ones, these are things that can make any anyone feel that way, and it can hit even harder if it stems from something as personal as one's identity. This movie does a beautiful job both conveying this concept while also making it abundantly clear how we got here to begin with. Nimona isn't miserable because she's a shapeshifter. We see plenty of times throughout the film that, when she's in a safe environment to do so, she gets a lot of joy from shapeshifting. It's this hatred from others and the subsequent isolation that drives her to such an attempt, and it's only a true display of acceptance and love that saves her from herself when Ballister overcomes his biases and decides that he cares for his friend, all of her. And while he may still be afraid, he doesn't let that override the care he shows.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I see you, Nimona, and you're not alone.
Looking at Nimona's story through the lens of the Allegory, we have a trans person living in a society that ostracizes and hates her, and it eventually drives her to a suicide attempt. That's definitely heavy, especially for a children's-oriented film, but it is an important story to tell, and I think that this movie did a beautiful job telling it. Even if you don't agree with my point, the story is both still good on its own, and could also be allegorical, I'm sure, for a number of other things, intentional or not. Allegories aren't meant to be one-to-one anyways, and a good story should have some sort of value for all of its potential audiences. So, I ask you, the viewer,
What did you get out of this film?
Because once everyone sees you as a villain, that's what you are. They only see you one way, no matter how hard you try.